growing up as children in the school of the Sri Aurobindo ashram, during certain special functions on the 2nd of December, they would sometimes play recorded messages of the mother. One of these messages, the mother says to all the children of the school in French, "Mes petits enfants, vous êtes l'espoir, vous êtes l'avenir. My little children, you are the hope, you are the future." And then the message continues, keep always this living aspiration within you, and so on. And when those children grow to be 60, 70, 80, 90, and you hear that message, we are still the children, isn't it? And when she gave this message in the 1960s, you are the hope, you are the future, that's us today. The future from then. And what is the hope that she held? And how far have we fulfilled? And yet, listening to that message, we find ourselves once again the children. We're still children at 80, 90, 100, and will always be before the Divine Mother. The theme for the discussion being integral education, I place it in this context. Normally, if you saw a topic like this, you say, yes, is it relevant for me? I don't have children, I'm not a teacher. I don't need to be educated because now I'm grown up, I'm an adult. And that is the unfortunate mistake of such a large part of humanity. But as spiritual aspirants and children of the Mother, we too tend to make that mistake. And so we will take this topic, this theme of integral education, by placing ourselves in the right context as children. Not only as children of the Divine Mother, for eternity perhaps, but children also in the school of life. Because formal schooling is at best a preparation for the true schooling of life. Unfortunately, that preparatory stage itself is so badly managed that mostly we pass out of the school, enter real life, and then we realize that everything we learnt is quite useless and we have to start from scratch. Even if you join a new workspace, they have to put you through a training program to bring you up to date to what they need, isn't it? So let's recognize that this is our school. And when we complete a certain phase, there is another phase. It's not quite the same as the military or the industrial schooling, where you have a test with each stage. And after the test, like an assembly line of a manufacturing sequence, after each processing, you do a test. If the piece passes the test, you continue to the next manufacturing process, shaping process. If you fail the test, you are ejected from the system, isn't it? Or thrown back for regrinding, reshaping, restamping, battering, to somehow force you to become some odd piece that's required for society, which is itself a gigantic machine, into which you will fit as one little wheel, dehumanized, machine within a machine. your creativity dulled or killed preferably, so that you may remain as a cogwheel and not try to become something more than you're supposed to, isn't it? Well, that's what the system did to us as children. Unfortunately, the imprint of that stays with us as adults. We are taught that we are this little thing that we were trained for. So, somebody was asked, I think it was in the United States Congress, somebody was asked, can you define a woman? What is a woman? And this was a lady, and she said, I don't know because I'm not a biologist. And this idea that unless I'm trained to be a biologist, I do not even have the right to think for myself, because I'm supposed to repeat what I learned by heart to pass a test for biology. It may seem a bit weird when you think about it this way, but what makes a good doctor from the examination perspective? Somebody who can learn a mass of information by heart and then apply it mechanically. A doctor is not supposed to be creative, at least in the training program of medicine. If you're creative, then you're going to fail, because you're supposed to follow the protocols which have been defined by others. You're supposed to give the specific medicines which you've been taught to be given for a certain combination of symptoms. So you have to have a good memory and then apply it mechanically. No thinking. Thinking doctors are very rare. But they're the ones, of course, who really do the miracles. Think about all the different things that we train children to be, and you'll find the bulk of it is just that, fit into a mold with a lot of programmed information, behavior pattern, and be projected into society, and you think you are just that. Since I'm not trained to be an engineer, I won't even try to think about how I can fix this problem with the air conditioning. I have to call an electrician or an engineer, isn't it? That kind of thinking is a self-contained box into which we have allowed ourselves to be fitted. And what's the reality? Well, you can say this is my reality on the surface of my nature because I've accepted the programming, but the deeper reality within of the soul as a spark or a projection, as an embodiment, as an incarnation of Satchidananda, which is infinite possibility, infinite knowledge, infinite power, here struggling to realize itself under finite conditions and opportunities, finds itself bound in the very first step of its emergence in the human life. When in fact our entire education should have been from the beginning to broaden, to plastify, to make as wide, as diverse, as rich as possible, and not putting into boxes. And it is only somebody who is entirely free and rich who can play the right role of any place. Even if you look upon society as a machine, you could go pretty much anywhere. There would be preferences, there would be aptitudes perhaps. But in principle, you should be able to do anything that you choose to do. And then society itself ceases to become a machine and becomes more and more a living organism, which is dynamically flowing to adapt to the needs of the collective. Such would be our sense of a more ideal approach to education. But at the center of it all will be this concept of the soul within as the one who needs to be given the means, the tools, the capacities in the personality for its full flowering. And once we accept this, we realize that our education is not only not over, but as adults by age, but children in spirit, as souls in evolution, we have just barely begun. What can you do today, considering that you are now in the school of life? Considering that this would be, let's say, broadly an ideal approach or ideal conceptualization of our educational program. What can we do today to develop these possibilities? When the body is small, when it is young, when it is growing, it's easy to shape it. Once it comes to a certain age and the growth stops, it's more difficult to shape it. With age, when it tends to become more rigid than plastic, then it's even more difficult to shape it. Recognizing that as a very practical circumstance, we can still do what we need to do, isn't it? So what would be our first priority? Think about it. To allow for the soul's full play of its potential for growth, you need a vehicle that is as plastic as possible. In order to make the vehicle plastic, whatever you're within the limitations of age, we won't speak about that now. Accepting that. How much more plastic can we make? To make it plastic, the first step would be to make it conscious. There's a line which comes to mind from Sri Aurobindo's little booklet, The Mother. When he speaks of the working of the Divine Mother's Shakti and her four aspects, which literally descend into us and work into us and form themselves in us. He says, if you desire this transformation, and describes what are the conditions. Of course, if you don't, it doesn't matter. But if you desire this transformation, and then I don't remember the exact words, and then he comes to this section where he says, 3 things you must have: consciousness, plasticity, surrender. You see, the goal we have set ourselves from an educational perspective is identical with the goal we have set ourselves from the evolutionary spiritual perspective. They're not different. It's the same thing, only a shift of priority. Where your school education would prioritize the growth of your external physical body, emotions and mind, and even that they mostly ignore, they just focus on certain narrow powers of the mind. Here the only shift would be, our prioritization would be from the soul's perspective of the opportunities for the soul's evolution and growth, and to that extent the plastification and development of the instruments of the soul, which include our mind, life and body. Not very different. Had the child's education begun the same way, it would have been a very different story. But let's take it that it was not. We are where we are. 3 things you must have: consciousness, plasticity, surrender. And this completes the goal of our practice of the integral yoga also. How do you make yourself more conscious? What can you do to increase consciousness? Looking at the 3 instruments, the physical body, the vital body and the mental body. How can you render them more conscious? Certain activities would be obvious. For the physical body in particular, one of the most simple would be paying conscious attention in its activity. Now, putting it in a most general way, and the mother actually recommends this as one of the exercises that would be helpful. When you take the stairs and you go up or down, you walk with full awareness. And it's not just being aware of the body in a general way, you can actually focus awareness on certain parts, and the legs perhaps, and the feet perhaps, or even the hands. So initially what you might want to do is to focus on certain parts, let's say starting with the feet and the calf muscles. As you walk, maybe here we use the elevator because the steps are not so convenient, but as you walk the corridor, become conscious and place each step consciously. Do it as an exercise. Take a walk around the pool with full awareness. Literally at that point, infusing your awareness into the tissue and the muscles and the feet. And when you come back, you will feel suddenly your feet are more conscious. And it stays quite a while, it stays a few hours, and then again tends to fade away. Focusing on different parts at different times as you walk in your normal routine of life, you can amplify this effect through certain practices of asanas, for example. As you do a simple stretch, again infusing awareness. We briefly touched upon this perhaps yesterday. The mind's awareness, to render the tissue of your body itself more conscious. And there are parts of the body which we are told we cannot feel, such as the bones or the grey matter of the brain. That's technically correct from a biological description of the most material part of the body. It's not correct in a subjective sense. You can feel your brain. You can feel your bones. Try it out, it's not difficult. But if you start with the belief that you've been programmed by the medical science, then you will block your capacity. In fact, you will notice you can feel far more just by accepting that it's possible. You can feel around your head. You can feel at the back of your head. You can feel at the back of your body. You sense when somebody passes close by, isn't it? But if you pay attention to it, it grows. So you realize it's not just the physical body limiting to the boundary of your tissue, but you can extend around to make conscious the extension of your physical body. Some of this happens almost automatically in certain kinds of activities. Many of you would drive cars. When you drive a car and you're about to take a very tight turn or you're parking in a very tight spot, you look back but you can't see the bumper of the car. You look in front but you can't see the actual tip of the bumper of the car. And yet, as you move, you can feel that it's about 2 centimeters away from the other car. You can feel it. And it's actually a sensation which is felt physically. It's part of the physical consciousness extending beyond the gross physical body into a kind of a subtle physical extension. Make that conscious, become conscious in that part of your physical, subtle physical. Taking it a notch up, your vital being, which includes your emotions, your life energies, the drives, the passions, the instinctive pulls and pushes, likes and dislikes, and the general sense of well-being and energy which sustains you. This is one of the things least developed in our current education. And there is practically nothing in life to compel you to develop this, unless you join the military, where they would deliberately try to infuse certain capacities, tendencies, even shape your instincts of the life force, because without a powerful vital, you are worthless in times of crisis, war, conflict. One of the aspects of this is what we call character. Character is almost the hardened, rigidified, instinctive form of your personality. The thing you do, the thing you are without thinking about it. At a moment of crisis, how do you behave? There's a very interesting test they do, at least in the Indian military. They used to, perhaps everywhere in the world. They would ask these new recruits to come to a pool, a diving board at a height, and looking down you find there is only a wooden floor from a height of several meters. And then you're told, jump. What do? You hesitate, you pull back, but the fellow says, go ahead, jump. Eventually, when you do jump, the wooden boards just open apart and you fall into a pool. What is interesting to see is, if somebody jumps mindlessly without thinking, he's thrown out of the military. This guy's not thinking. But if you hesitate, you think, you look around, make a conscious decision, and then jump, okay, that's the guy we want. But the instinct is what you're being made to face and then shaped. But that's for a very narrow, limited objective. If we had to develop our vital body fully, there are ranges which belong to the lower vital, which are more instinctive: self-preservation, desire, procreation, impulse, food, all kinds of instincts which are all centered around me and my. The higher part of the vital opens out: heroic, sharing, giving, exchanging, taking, participating in a larger collective space. It's still me, but in a larger extension. That's why lower, smaller, larger, higher. They're still the same vital energies, but operating on two different levels. The lower is the part of the life energy bound to the physical body, and therefore more instinctive and narrow. The higher is open to the mind, influenced by the mind's wideness and flexibility, and therefore naturally more wide. Heroism, courage, selfless action are typical of the higher vital, if so developed. Think about it. How many opportunities in life do you have to experience these things? Interestingly, some of the best ways in which you can experience this in a vicarious manner is by watching good movies. Movies of heroism, courage, historic events, but which have something uplifting, of great personages or great events always. Even when the story ends with self-sacrifice in which all perish, you have participated in their decision to accept, to give up their lives for the larger cause. And you experience the growth that happens with them. And even as you perish, there is the soul's exaltation. I achieved. I did. I lived up for this. There's a very interesting incident narrated by a French writer who I would highly recommend his book for those who follow French. He had spontaneously out-of-body experiences and subsequently recall of past lives. And one of the most powerful memories that he had, which he says literally defines his character in this life, was of a period in Rome. And this is the period that Sri Aurobindo describes as the phase when nature was still playing with pure types. And having developed pure types, she then mixes them to create more complex types. And today we are a bundle of so many mixtures. But we've been through that phase, all of us, of pure types, where we have developed certain aspects and tendencies and capacities which are there in the soul's memory and sometimes brought forward to infuse in this personality. And he recalls how in Rome, in Italy, near Rome, they were part of a group that had been betrayed. They were then arrested and tortured to reveal certain information, and they refused. They clung to that ideal. They were thrown in the most brutal way into pits, allowed to die painfully over days, literally bleeding to death, and yet clinging to the ideal. The soul's exaltation that, yes, I was able to cling to that even at the most extreme peril and death. That imprint stayed with him. And he said is a large part which defines his personality today. To stand for an ideal, to stand for a greater truth, and not to give in. We are not conscious of how much of our current personality is actually influenced by such past aspects, where we had to go through an entire lifetime to develop just a tiny aspect, which today becomes a facet of our personality. And all these I give as examples of aspects of the vital nature, vital consciousness, which we must be able to develop. Generosity, a true wideness of generosity. You've all seen somebody or other of this kind. Without hesitation, they give with a generosity in which you can feel that they know they always have abundance. They will never lack. They know it and they can just flow. And you look at them and say, wow, I wish I could have that. And you look at yourself, you say, oh my God, I shrink, I fear, I have so many insecurities about my own future or my lack or my incapacities. And it's an aspect of the vital consciousness widening out, opening out to be able to express that bountifulness possible for all of us if we work upon it. I give cinema as a good example, but do you have perhaps real life examples around you? If you're fortunate, observe them, look at them. Which of these aspects or qualities would you want to develop first? So I'm going to digress a little bit now and then we'll come back to this because we will use this principle on all levels. How do you decide what should be your priority? I'm going to digress a bit. And by asking you a question, when you go to a program, a function, an activity, a lecture, a music concert, whatever it is. You've gone to one and then you come back and say, wow, that was fantastic. You go to another, you come back, oh, that was boring. What makes this fantastic, wonderful, interesting, and the other boring? What's the distinctive feature which makes for interesting or not interesting? Think about it. Yes? Enjoying happiness? Newness? Yes? Connection? So, the common feature among all these things, why did you feel happy doing this? Okay, let's say you went to this happy one. You go a second day, a third day, a fourth day to exactly the same thing. After a while you say, boring. What changed? The first time you went and the fourth time you went. What has happened? Interesting. So the first time that you went, of course you learned so much more. By the fourth time that you went or the 10th time you went, there's nothing more left to learn. That's when it becomes boring. So you notice now something very interesting. Something very interesting is, whenever you experience growth, learning, you come back and say it was interesting. When the potential for growth has been exhausted and there's no more learning taking place, you come back and say, boring. Novelty can be an aspect of growth also. But novelty fades out very quickly because the growth component within novelty is tiny. But there are other kinds of activities where the growth component is large enough that you could go multiple times and still say, yes, I grew slightly less than the first time, but I think I can do one more, it's worth it. So we come to a very important conclusion. Growth equals interesting. No growth equals not interesting. Okay? This is a very good, important insight, and we're going to apply this in our own learning and training, and of course for our children if you do it for them. So when I asked this question earlier, when you have to develop various aspects of your vital potential, which one would you turn to first? And a very simple criteria you apply, which one do you think will be most interesting for you? In other words, which one will you feel the most growth? Think about that. It goes both ways. If something attracts you and you feel, yes, it was going to be worth it, it's because something inside you recognizes here is a great growth potential and it's going to be worth it. So we'll use that as a reference and we'll see how much more profound it is as an insight later on. But as a first reference, anything where you say, this I would really like to experience, this really I would like to have as a glimpse, focus on those first. We'll use this as a powerful principle to assess at any given time, in any kind of work of growth or experience or training or learning. Interesting is your first entry point, because that means there you're going to have lots of growth. And when it ceases to be interesting, review. Either you're approaching it the wrong way, shift the emphasis, shift the priority, find an aspect of growth that you have missed, or change the activity altogether. And if something is not interesting, doesn't mean that it won't be interesting after a year. It means right now, it's not going to give you growth because you're not ready for it. So looking at a child, and this is the big mistake schools make today, at the age of 3 or 4, they try to get them to start writing. The fine motor skills are not developed sufficiently. The brain itself is not ready for that activity. And you're forcing a child to do something which is for them boring. Painfully boring, age 3, 4, 5, 6, around 6 or 7, typically more 7, the brain is ready for it, and within 6 months the child gets the skill. But you made him suffer for 4 years before. In the ashram school, recognizing this principle, we just make them draw large shapes of letters once, and that's it, not much writing. So the larger motor skills are used. At the age of 6, 7, the writing starts, and within 6 months, they achieve with joy, because now it's fun and the brain is enjoying the learning. In 6 months, they achieve what others have struggled for 6 years, painfully. And here they've done it with joy. So it's not that just because it's boring now that you will not find it interesting later. Just recognize that's going to come up later on. So you start with something which is very interesting, you expand that to the maximum, and then you find now this is fading out, but on the boundary of what was interesting, something else begins to open, and then something else. And then having explored 2 or 3 areas, there's a huge complementing aspect which is missing and now calls you. You turn to that and fill that, and then you realize there's a gap between these 2 complementing aspects. You fill the in-between. And then there's a period of assimilation and merging and an activity that flows across all these different facets. And it's fully integrated, and you find yourself wide, rich, grown, like a beautiful tree with many different branches, but balanced now equally. That's how nature works in us in learning and growth. With little children, the scope is far more diverse and more detailed. As adults, perhaps the diversity is somewhat less, but exact same principle. To whatever extent it is constrained by your other responsibilities does not matter. Follow this. So our natural guide will be a kind of a deeper instinctive, intuitive, and perhaps even still deeper soul inclination which will lead you, or a mix of all these, doesn't matter. So you work on the vital in this way. If you can, if you have the scope, take up theatre. And again, never think of these activities as something you're going to do for life or for a career. That's part of the programming of the industrial education, to make you think anything you do, you must be very good at, you must excel, and it must become your career. Silly. You must do because it gives you joy, because it's interesting, it's fun. And that's opening facets of your capacities. And so as an adult, join a local theatre group once a week for a few weeks until you say, okay, been there, done that, now I want something more. Or you may enjoy it so much you may continue for a few years. Or you may change the focus of what kind of roles you play or practices in the theatre itself. Or maybe the person who's teaching is doing it the wrong way, you want a different kind. See, very often when you go to take up music classes, they start with basic training. You must learn to play the basic notes or sing the basic notes. I don't want to do that. I just want to sing my heart out. So a good teacher would start by getting you to sing your heart out and then fine-tune the precision of the notes. So perhaps you need to change the teacher also. But you will know, you will feel and trust what you feel. Developing your vital in this way, widening it, strengthening it, deepening its resilience and inner strength. One of the things which I wish I had sufficiently developed is what in French is called sang-froid, cold blood, literally. That is, in a situation of crisis, to be able to remain calm and unmoved, not shaken. I've seen this happen. and unfortunately it happens in very strange situations. A lady makes an approach and says, I'm here, I want to discuss, and there's a whole group that is in revolt. They start shouting abuses at her. Very strange. And she stood her ground, held a calm, smiled, and said, I'm here to talk. Eventually the group that was abusing walked away. Interesting. Because she could hold her ground in calm, they could not stand it. But I realize or most of us, I think, in that situation would have perhaps broken down or walked away, and that group would have felt triumphant. We managed to get rid of her. I saw that, I said, wow, this lady is somebody. Worthy. But I wish I had that capacity. I've not had much occasion to be able to develop this, but so you observe things around you and you say, wow, this resonates. I feel I could. Well, start working upon it. We're still looking at a very superficial way of training. We will find still deeper ways, but this is our first starting point. And then we come to the mind. And the mind is something so rich, so complex, so multifaceted. And our conventional education has barely touched some possibilities. Mostly what they call left brain faculties, and within that some narrow memory aspects. Analytics and memory, that's about it. The larger capacities, which are described as the right brain faculties, the creative, the intuitive, are mostly left untouched. And here you have this very interesting, provocative statement of Sri Aurobindo, which this morning Aurelio read out, where Sri Aurobindo says, between them, music, art and poetry are a perfect education for the soul. They make and keep its movements purified, self-controlled, deep and harmonious. So he says these should not be neglected in humanity's development. But by soul, he means here not the psychic being yet. Because you have to see the context, where earlier he describes these. He describes how art, particularly the painting or the sculptures, they refine, but with a consciousness which is static. The thing cannot move in space or time. So it brings a certain kind of a calm in the refinement. In contrast, so painting and sculpture work in the same direction by different means. Art sometimes uses the same means as poetry, but cannot do it to the same extent because it has not the movement of poetry. It is fixed, still, it expresses only a given moment, a given point in space, and cannot move freely through time and region. But it is precisely this stillness, this calm, this fixity, which gives its separate value to art. And then he compares this with poetry. Poetry raises the emotions and gives each its separate delight. If you had a rich palette of poetry, each touching certain aspects of your emotions and allowing you to enjoy the delight of these, just as an equivalent, it's not the same, but as an equivalent, you have before you a spread of cinema. There is everything from adventure to drama to social tensions to romance to humor, and there's a rich palette. What would you pick right now, today? Maybe tomorrow you pick something else. And you'll notice you will pick the thing which you feel right now would be most nourishing for you. Even if you have a favorite genre, it just means there's something within you that's craving that experience. And when you've had too much of that, then you go for the opposite extreme, isn't it? So poetry, if it could be instead of cinema, but with a refinement, with an uplifting of the emotions of a full spread palette. So in the Indian tradition of theatre, they speak of 9 distinctive Rasa. Rasa is the juice, the sap of joy, delight, of types of emotional experience in this case. And if somebody could make a collection like that, it would be very useful to share. But you see how this would work. And then Sri Aurobindo continues. Art stills the emotions and teaches them the delight of a restrained and limited satisfaction. This indeed was the characteristic that the Greeks, a nation of artists far more artistic than poetic, tried to bring into their poetry. So that's art. And then music deepens the emotions and harmonizes them with each other. And then he says, between them, music, art and poetry are a perfect education for the soul. So you see, the soul here is being used in a more general sense, the refined individual person. But that he uses that word soul is also suggestive. If in the turn to art, music and poetry, you sought out those still finer spiritual qualities or psychic qualities, then these can become vehicles for the uplift of the true soul, the inmost soul, the psychic being within us, and its influence to fill our personality. So you start with that which is to you the most interesting, the most accessible, and then try to take it to a deeper refinement, opening to those finer qualities through these three vehicles of art, music, poetry. Which of these would you take first? Whatever your temperament, observe. Start with that. And if that is for you already familiar, choose deliberately the other or the other two. If you particularly enjoy poetry, well, turn to music, turn to art also. If you particularly enjoy only music, have you ever tried poetry truly? Turn to that. Spread it out. Try out all these, because you have noticed now what are the three different things they do within you. And deliberately expose yourself to these. And it does not mean you have to necessarily go out and find only the psychic influence. Even when you expose yourself to other kinds, observe what effect it has on you. There's a very interesting program that some people have put together, and perhaps another time we could do this as an exercise. I would play different kinds of music, observe where it touches you, how it affects you, how it changes you. Simply notice. And that itself is an education, because it makes you conscious of those parts within you, but also makes you conscious of how things from outside affect you. And the same you would do for all these three: poetry, music, art. Try out different things. Observe the effects. Play with it. Enrich. And then you look for something which goes deeper and higher and so on. If you have a natural inclination for creating these, art, music or poetry, that again becomes for you a vehicle for your growth. So far it was a passive reception, or perhaps even an active reception, but you can now become an active creator of these. That's difficult. I am not a poet. Those guys, they are the great poets. That's the programming of your school education. You don't have to be great. You just have to have fun doing it, right? So start writing a simple poem. Construct it with your mind. Don't worry about it. Just do it. And then look at it and enjoy the creation that you made. And then go again and again and again. And there's a point where suddenly you'll find the faculty opens up, kicks in, and there's something which begins to flow. And again, it does not have to be very high or deep. It may be a mental creation, but play with it. Just that will open up the faculties of what we call right brain. I don't like to reduce it to brain, because it's not brain. Sri Aurobindo actually uses the phrase right-hand faculties and left-hand faculties. That's the yogic term. Of knowledge, of consciousness. And he writes this before modern science discovered that left and right brain have different functions. So he was already ahead because of this yogic knowledge. So Play with these intuitive, creative parts of your consciousness and don't worry about level at first. As the facility grows, as the joy grows, you will find certain states produce different results than your normal states. And now you begin to chase or access those states consciously. It's very interesting. You notice the days when you feel more connected, it just flows. And days when it's not connected, it's broken up, it's not happening, it's not flowing. What did I do yesterday? And you shift your state and click, the flow begins. So you have to actually try this out to experience how simple it is. And in this way, you're actually developing faculties and learning to access layers and ranges of your consciousness by doing this in this way. And then bit by bit, you will notice this state and that state. This feels more deep. This feels more refined. This feels closer to my bhakti or a psychic influence or something higher which aligns with my aspiration. You notice these differences. So it becomes a kind of an objective reference of an introspective process. Very interesting. And this would apply for all three: art, music, poetry. Play with paints, play some music, sing from your heart, whatever form it may take. Play an instrument. When my mother had us as children soon after she got married, so it's around the age 25 or so. She has 2 kids, then she is busy looking after kids. When she comes to the ashram, she is looking after the work in the ashram, and she was looking after my teacher, and he passed away when she was about 50, and she's still looking after the work that he was doing, and then she reached about 60. And I said to her, you know what? Now it's your turn. You go out there and do those things and I'll look after the house. So I pushed her out and encouraged her to go and try out everything that she had ever wanted to do in her life. So she started at the age of 60, started swimming, joined the theater, started painting, started dancing classes, calligraphy classes, and a whole range of, I remember, about a dozen different things. Just have fun, do it, learn. Open out those aspects of your faculties or personality. And then after a few years, some of these automatically stopped. Okay, this I don't need so much. Certain things stopped because the biology was no more. She would cycle down at the age of 60, going to the Matri Mandir and arranging flowers there every Sunday. And after some time, it was no more safe to cycle because of the traffic. So things stopped. But then the personality opened up in a way that could not have happened otherwise. Age is no bar. Now she's 80. About a year back when she was 80, I said to her, you've not written poetry, start writing poetry. As a way of developing the intuitive and connecting to the intuition. So with certain indications, and that was it. That's all she needed. She started it. What was fascinating was, some days she would come home and she's written 3 poems. And you could see the days when literally a lighting up in the personality because of what flowed through. And I've been seeing now, it's a little more than a year that she's been doing. What is fascinating to watch, yes, there's a difference because the 3 languages she's using, her mother tongue in which the fluency is greatest, and in English the fluency is not so strong, and yet as the intuition kicks in, there are words which drop in, concepts which drop in, which were not constructed. She describes a person in a poem because it's that person's birthday, and in 6 lines she has captured the essential aspects of that individual's personality, just like that. And it's a kind of an insight into the personality which I would not have had. But reading the poem, I say, wow, what an insight. And of course, it's not constructed. It's the intuition beginning to trickle in and developing its own forms. Age 80 does not matter. Because we are first and foremost, remember, spirit, Satchidananda, consciousness. And these are instruments and vehicles. The moment you start, even from below, opening upward, from above, all that we truly are begins to trickle down and begins to make these links. Start now, start today. I don't know what you will do, but find something to do. Of all the things we will discuss today, find something to do today. And then something every day if you can. If nothing else, take a walk around the pool, consciously, infusing in the body consciousness. Okay. So developing the creative aspects, and these three particularly would be good starting points. But there are other creative aspects, including technically creative aspects. Observe what is your natural temperament. Remember, what's interesting is your first indication. But then what you have never done, but seems interesting from far, you have to break the barrier and actually do it. So there was a phase for many years, because I grew up in the ashram. Okay, there's an interesting background to it. It gets somewhat personal, but at the age of 5, it's as if something from deep within surged out, looked at the future, and then said, this. It was as if blinders were put on the mind. This. And it was as if decided the ashram, the center, the focus of the work there, this, nothing else. And since then, all through my teenage years, I was not allowed to, chose to rather, not even think about any other possibility. There was a teacher who once gave us homework to write a story. Imagine all of you students going into forest and something. I refused to write because it involved something which is not this. But much later, long after teenage, I think around the age of 29, 30, the blinders had to be removed, because you can't have your mind like that, right? You have to open to the infinite. But once the formation of the personality was sufficiently stable, certain foundations inner had been laid, blinders had to be removed, and I felt intense struggle, clinging to them. Oh, don't take it out. That's my protection. Until literally they were pulled by force. And I said, yes, that's what it is. So during that period, when I accepted, okay, I have to loosen up and make my personality more flexible, I just decided whatever someone tells me, can you do this? I'll say yes. We were in a restaurant and they had this fancy, the waiters would come and just do some dance with music. And somebody said, why don't you join them? I said, no. And then I said, oh, what am I saying? Yes. And I got up and did my little dance and sat down. Okay, I just broke another little barrier. But observe, the things you shrink from doing, not because they're bad, but because what will people think? I'm too old for that. I'm not a kid anymore. That's for kids. When you have a shrinking barrier, break it consciously. Plastify, make yourself more elastic, opening out to possibilities. Of course, within not exposing yourself to danger, within practical limitations, but do that consciously. And do you know why this is important? See, for many of us, we are also at an age, and I put myself in that category, where we have crossed the larger part of our life. And what remains ahead, considering a typical lifespan, is shorter than what we have passed. And so on some level, we are conscious that we have limited time. And one of the big questions which bothers me, or used to bother me, was, what happens next time round? This time I had an extraordinary opportunity. Physically, at the age of 6 months, I come into the ashram. I'm blessed by the mother physically. And then after that, I grew up in that environment with that extraordinary atmosphere. And much after, when that atmosphere has already dimmed quite a bit, I have my teacher with whom it was as intense. And after that, I still have all the opportunities of the freedom to grow as necessary. If I have not done something, it's entirely my fault. The opportunities were always there. And I can see that those who are coming today as children don't have the same. Because the environment is so much more clouded, so much more confused. Circumstances are so much more in collision. You're pulled and pushed, and the desires and the strong formative influences, distorting influences are far greater. We had a protected life in a way. When I come around the next time, none of these support systems will be there. What would I do? Even finding good parents, Difficult, right? And then, so I said, there's only one thing I can do. Create the circumstances now that a little bubble, a little island might survive the future to which I could come back. Right? Very selfish intention. But I'm putting this in a more general context. You see around you a kind of a chaos that is increasing, a kind of a confusion that is growing. And if you extrapolate, it's going to get worse before it gets better. Eventually it will get better, but before that it's going to get worse, and perhaps much worse. And all of this Sri Aurobindo has described. So it's not something which I am fantasizing about. He's given reasons why. He's shown the way out of it. And the necessity for the way out of it is this spiritual foundation to be strengthened in us individually and collectively. But you can't expect that in the world. It's not going to happen, at least not so soon. What we can do is to create these little islands of spiritual concentrated aspiration. And that's what these gatherings are about, isn't it? We create these little islands in which we nourish each other, and sometimes the islands are somewhat virtual. They might be spread out in physical space, but psychologically they're islands that through the present darkness we pass through, and when the darkness ends, there is something worthwhile upon which to rebuild. Because the darkness will end in our lifetime. But what will we have on the other side? And that's why it's so important today to gather. The term used is tapas, concentrated, intensified aspiration, focus, deepening, intensifying, widening of consciousness, raising the consciousness in our little group, within individuals as well as in our collective interactions. And nobody can stop you from doing that. And as you come through, that will be the base on which things will be built. That's the future that we have to work for. That's our responsibility today. There's nothing else more important than this. And of course it starts with yourself, but it extends into the small collective. So coming out on the other side, you have something worthwhile. And then of course when I come back the next time, well, those will be the little islands. Good for me. Yes, it's a way of joking. It's selfish in a way, but really it's the work to be done for humanity. But I come back to the point that we have to prepare ourselves, gather, concentrate in this way, because it is the necessity for the future humanity. Because there are still so many souls who wish to take birth with an aspiration, and at least we will provide for them these containers, these vehicles, these spaces in which they may nurture as intended. Isn't it? So, coming back to our larger discussion of our preparation, develop these faculties of your so-called right brain or creative, intuitive powers. And in none of these that I have described, the physical body, the vital and the mental capacities, in none of these have I spoken of a deeper spiritual or psychic content. Those would naturally come in, but you can start with what you are, as you are, without worrying about whether you can provide for something deeper or higher. Isn't it? So, it's not difficult, because you can do this as you are. As you proceed, those elements will come in necessarily, because that's our aspiration. We would not be satisfied doing something superficially, isn't it? We would automatically deepen, allow the deepening to take place. Remember, from above you will get the help. So I identified the objectives of the integral yoga along with the objectives of the integral education in a certain sense, but then let's draw upon the knowledge of integral education to be able to effectuate this process and amplify it. You will recall in Sri Aurobindo's writings on education, There are 3 principles of true teaching. The first is that nothing can be taught. And so the teacher's role is actually to be a helper and a guide. Why can't you teach? Because you can only force from outside to mug up, but mugging up is not learning. Memorizing is not learning. Learning is when something within you changes in a way that you say, ah, yes, of course. So I give an example here. Somebody gives you a question, a problem to resolve. You think about it, and going back to your school years, typically, that's when we had these occasions, and you can't find an answer, and if the teacher keeps saying, think more, I don't know how to think more, that's all I can think. But somebody may suggest to you, hey, look at it this way. You change the perspective in which you see a problem, and then suddenly, I got it. That movement of an awakening, of a dawning of knowledge, it's a very Vedic symbol. Dawning, literally light filling you. I got it. And then you see what, it's a very interesting moment. First you have the excitement, I got it. And then what do you do next? You try to help someone else. Look at it this way, it's very simple, it's so obvious, it's so simple. Now notice several elements here. When you say obvious, what do you mean? It means it's self-evident. Well, why couldn't I see it before? Because I was looking at it the right way. I was looking at it the wrong way. So I was looking at the board from the front, but when I turn it around, I see, aha, this was hidden behind. It's obvious, right? So it's a discovery. Cover, discover, right? All knowledge, from a yogic point of view, is discovering. Because at the moment where it has become aha obvious, you discover something inside you already knew, but it was covered. And the removal of the covering brought forward what you already knew. Very interesting. All true learning involves discovering or a coming forward of what you already knew. Anything taken from outside is like a coat of paint. I apply red paint, white paint, green paint, there's rain and it all gets washed away. Typically the rain is equivalent of going to sleep at night, you wake up, it's all washed away. You're back to where you were. But when it's discovered, you have grown and nobody can take it away from you because you are what you know. This is a very important understanding. True knowledge is always in identity. You are it, that's when you know it. Anything which is not held in identity is not true knowledge and will be lost, will be forgotten. What may happen is somebody from outside telling you something may help evoke what you know, and so there's a kind of an identity from outside in, but it's still the inner emerging which is your true knowledge, not the outside element. You know it in your own way, distinctively, right? Notice something else which happened with this aha, dawning of knowledge. There's a great joy. Very interesting. Why is it a joy? Because it was a spark of light of Satchidananda knowledge. It is Sat Chit Ananda. The Chit has the aspect of knowledge and aspect of force of knowledge, Chit Shakti. So there's the light, there's the force, and immediately you want to put it into action because you've discovered it. You can't prevent yourself. Either you share it with others or you put it into action to actualize what you know, what you are. But with it is the Ananda aspect, the delight of the discovery and the delight of being and the delight of creating. All these come in a flash. Satchidananda is not far away, but this is a reflection of a reflection, but it is still Satchidananda, isn't it? Every moment of discovery is flash, reflection of that. Now you know what that is like. If this state of flash could be widened out to infinity and sustained into eternity, that is Satchidananda. That eternity reduced to a moment and then reflected in a tiny piece of finite momentary flash is your reflected Sachidananda, isn't it? All life, all growth is really that which grows within you. And because of that flash, you have grown, you have changed. Fascinating. So, every experience must be, aha, now I know it, it's mine because it is discovered. At the end of this session, I would ask you to look back. Everything that I said, you should be able to say, oh yeah, I already knew it. He just reminded me of it, right? Then we will say, yes, this was worthwhile. And you'll never forget it. Even if you forget the words I spoke or the examples I gave, what changed in you, what woke in you is yours, is you, and will come up in your own way a few years down. You will one day say, you know what, I just had a brilliant idea, and exactly that thing appears, which is now yours. Right? Okay, so when nothing can be taught, this is the only way to learn. And the task of the teacher is to evoke the aha experiences. Who's the teacher now giving you the aha experiences? Life, the Divine Mother, you yourself. I choose to learn this. I choose to develop and explore and play with it. That's why playing is so important. When you play, you end up trying out different things, and suddenly there's a discovery. But for that, you should be willing to play without fear. You see little children, you give them a tablet to play. They make all kinds of crazy experiments, but discover eventually, sort it out, and then master it. And as adults, what happens? Will something go wrong? Will I damage it? Will I make a mistake? Will I delete by chance? I don't know. Tell me what to do. Where should I touch? Should I touch this or that? Tell me. You're afraid to try out. Where did that fear come from? Well, that's part of the programming. Throw it all out. Play with it freely. Do not fear to make mistakes. This is one of the big distortions of current education. They teach you to fear mistake, because if you make one mistake in your exam, you're finished for life. For life, you're stamped with a 94.1% instead of a 94.2%. And just that is your cutoff mark that throws you out of this elite institution. Oh, how terrible. Right? What's your SAT score? I'm stuck with that for life because it's now part of the public record. Isn't it? You can't afford to make a mistake. And that's not how you can learn. The only way you can learn, and Sri Aurobindo puts it even in the spiritual context, you must have the freedom to make mistakes. That's how you'll find your boundaries, you'll find your limits, and then you will expand your boundaries and grow out of your limits. So, once you're conscious, it'll be easy to do. The moment you see, you take a tablet, I'm afraid, well, do exactly what you're afraid of. Of course, within common sense, you don't stick your finger in an electrical plug, but play with it. Break those boundaries, okay? And the result will be that you will begin to learn rapidly. Now, Sri Aurobindo has a very deep insight here. He says not only the teacher is assisting you for this process of discovery, but nature has implanted within you two profound impulses by which this will happen automatically. You see, nature has a vested interest in your survival and in your growth and in your perfection, right? So she has to ensure that things are given even if the parents are not there. So what are the two impulses in every child? That includes us, by the way. Two gifts of nature, he says. The first, an insatiable curiosity. And the second, he says, every child is a hero worshipper. Now look at us. What happened to my curiosity? Well, mom taught me, no, my mother didn't, but mostly my teachers taught me, stop asking silly questions. Sit there, be quiet, don't talk. Right? So I have this curiosity, but I get scolded every time. I learn to dim it and then extinguish it. But it doesn't go away. It comes up in other ways. So the child is sitting in the classroom, be quiet, don't talk, and he's looking around. What can I do? Oh, that child's slippers. He reaches out, pulls their slippers, pushes it away. Oh, he's doing mischief. No, he's just exploring his curiosity and his activity. But we are like that as adults. Have you noticed when we are backbiting somebody and criticizing somebody and gossiping about somebody? That's really the impulse now, warped, distorted, stunted. To know more, to share more, to learn more. What's the latest news? What's the latest gossip? It's really that impulse, totally warped out. Consciously we'll remove these distortions and veils and accept consciously, I want to know everything about everything. But I have my interests and priorities according to my needs and temperament. Okay. One day everything about everything, maybe in over a few dozen lives, but right now, what about what? And focus on those, start with those, right? But reawaken that curiosity. Ask yourself every day, every moment, why this, why this, why is it like that, why is it like that? So I have still to figure out, I'll give an example. We were trying to fiddle around to change the temperature, and there's a little thing which you scroll, and when it scrolls, it makes a hissing sound. It's compressed air released. I want to figure out why it is using compressed air. What was the rationale behind it? And I won't leave this room until I've sorted that out, over the next couple of days if needed. And if I can't find the answer, I'm going to ask somebody, or I will look it up on the internet, right? You have that advantage. In the old days, as I was growing up, you had to go to the library and you were lucky if you found a book that had some answers. Now you just type the question and you get your answers. Nothing can stop you. But ask yourself, be curious, increase the curiosity. So the method we use with little children is to feed the curiosity more. Every time they ask a silly question, silly for us because I don't have an answer and it puts me in a bad light to say, I don't know, kid. So it's silly. First thing we say, what an interesting question. Now if I don't have an answer, I can say, I don't have an answer to that. Or maybe I can make a guess. But since I will make a guess, what do you think? What's your guess? Right? Because any guess is as good as the other. Or, that's a very good question. Since I don't know the answer, I'm going to be busy the next few hours. Can you find the answer and tell me? I'm also very curious. Right? And you're going to do that to yourself. I've got a question now. I want to find an answer. Well, find it. And if you can't find it now, postpone it, but find it eventually. And by feeding the curiosity, it grows like the flame. Because the root of this curiosity goes back all the way to the soul, psychic being. The experience of the psychic being, when it enters into incarnation, when it decides to project into the universe and take birth, the experience is, what an infinity of opportunities. All this formed of the foam of Satchidananda, and I'm going to plunge into it to explore and to discover. Adventure. Right? Once I had, on my terrace, in Pondicherry, the houses are joined, so you can hop across one terrace to another. So there were kids from a neighboring house who were climbing across. And for years, I followed the instinct, invitation of my elders who would shout, hey, who's there? Don't come here. And one day I came into my own and I said, why am I saying something so stupid? Let me see what they're doing. So I went up. I find these 4 kids, young kids, they've just come to Pondicherry, they've rented the house, and they're climbing up and going across. So I'm holding back my impulse to say, hey, don't. I said, what are you doing? And the first in a line, the first kid says, he's going to be a leader in the future. He turns around and says proudly, we are on an adventure. And there's this light in his eyes. And my heart melted. How can I say don't? So I said, okay, watch this part. This is made of fragile material. Here it could crack, so don't put your feet there, but this part is safe. And I watched them. And for a moment I said, my God, I wish I could be with them and have that adventure. They were having so much fun. It's curiosity. But our whole life is our adventure for the soul. And from the soul's perspective, there's the eternity of time to explore this wonderful universe. formed of form of Satchidananda, of delight, and discovery is therefore delight, isn't it? Every spark of discovery is that, and it's for the series of spark eventually for the embracement of the delight that we are born. And this is the soul's perspective. The curiosity, the inquisitiveness is insatiable precisely because it is to know the infinity. So it's an aspect of your psychic being to want to know, to grow, and to discover. So encourage it, nourish it, if you like, through the mind, through the emotion, through the senses, but behind that know this deeper truth, and perhaps you open to its sense of discovery, filling these. Okay? So, first gift of nature is this insatiable curiosity tracing back to the inner source. And the second gift was every child, he says, is a hero worshipper. Isn't it? So to the first, he even puts it in this way. Every child is a scientist, is a botanist, is all these terms because of the nature of the curiosity. But here what happens, now you're looking to somebody who has already attained to what you want. And you look at them and say, yes, I want to be like that. So you ask a little child, what do you want to be when you grow up? I will be like, typically it's the parents or some uncle or somebody whom they have deified already. What is it they're looking for? And you will notice some preeminent quality that attracts them. I remember we would walk to kindergarten and we would pass by the governor's house and there was a policeman on duty. And there will be a few among my friends who would say, I want to be a policeman. He did incidentally. Many years later, I asked him what's he doing, and he said he was involved in a security with a bank in Canada. Interesting. But that was because something in his nature wanted to be that heroic aspect of standing for defense for an ideal, isn't it? Maybe there were elements of the past incarnations, I don't know. But what is it that draws you and makes you look at someone and say, wow, I wish I could be like that? Notice in the attempt to be like that, what is the child doing? Observe animals. You have pets, some of you? Cats, dogs perhaps? I don't have so much experience with cats, but with dogs you will notice they stare at you. They wait for you. They're so happy when you give them a task to do or when you teach them some skill. And literally it's as if through their eyes they drink you. It's as if they're absorbing the human consciousness and becoming more human in the process. Little children do that with their parents. Parents do that instinctively with children. You hug the child and you pour your heart, pour your love, infuse your energy into your child, which is literally forming their character at that point with what you are. And the child soaks up, yearns to be lifted, yearns to be hugged in order to grow and soak. So, very superficial modern research says if children have a lot of tactile contact, they grow more intelligent and they are more confident. So it's reduced to just, hey, you gave them contact. So you could replace the human being by a robot which goes 2 every 2 hours. No, it won't work. Because it's not the tactile contact. It's the infusion of energy that flows in that contact, in that embracement. The love that you pour into the child awakens in him the capacity to love because he knows what it feels like. And all the other aspects of the character are literally being infused and formed. But equally from the child's side, he looks to parents and drinks in, or whatever greater symbol you have. And unfortunately today the media promotes symbols of, from the cinema and so on. They're not very interesting, not very inspiring. And yet the child wants to hero worship. What will we do? What's the hero worship you would like to do? Think about it. You can look at it on many levels. You can look at individuals, as I said, cinema of historical events and historic individuals, very inspiring, reading biographies, individuals today that you know personally who have an aspect of something that you cherish. Look at that and say, what would that person do? And so in a part of your consciousness you identify with them, or you try to feel what they would do, and then you do it. But which one is the personality that combines all these personalities? But it goes to a level of abstraction. The consciousness which incarnates in all these. The one consciousness which is infinite potential, infinite qualities, infinite aspects. And that is the divine consciousness. So this would be the yogic method of doing it. Literally, you turn to the divine consciousness in your experience, in your heart's aspiration, and with that aspect. So let's say I want to develop this sense of strength and courage and resilience. So you could use a historical personage or somebody you know. Or I think of this woman, for example, who stood that ground. I said, wow, if I could be like that. Unconsciously, I'm identifying as if taking an imprint of her, unknowingly. But now I turn to the Divine Mother and I say, here is this quality, and you envisage the quality and feel the quality and turn towards it as if absorbing, assimilating, receiving a descent of that quality within you. Something, now you don't have to give names to it. You feel the quality and align. But now if you had to approach it theoretically, I would say what you did was to align to an aspect of the Mahakali force perhaps. Isn't it? Or Maheshwari aspect, the vast, equal base which is unshaken in its wide perspective and knowledge. And that you as if receive, infuse, embody, and you are changed. So there are various ways you could take up, and I'm showing you all these. Start playing with it, experimenting, explore, grow. Use this hero worship instinct, because we have it even as adults, even though it's been dulled. And the truth of it spiritually is the psychic being that turns to the infinite and opens itself to the touch of the infinite, allowing itself to be shaped by the infinite. Page 444, easy to remember. Read it on your own later. Sri Aurobindo explaining what is this thing called pain. Pain is the hand of nature sculpturing men to greatness. An inspired labor chisels with heavenly cruelty an unwilling mold. The mold here is our personality and all these layers and different parts, multidimensional. The mold itself is unwilling, because by instinct we are happy to be what we are. Why are you making me change? I'm so happy to be what I am, right? When you get married, you come under pressure to change. It's a point of great resistance. You take a new job, you suffer change momentarily, you come home to be what you are. There you can do, but when you're married, you don't have a choice. At home, you have to change. Very painful. As a child, it's not so difficult because you're still shaping, and the pain almost compels the shaping. As an adult, it becomes very difficult. But unwilling because of this, because we have a natural instinctive tendency to remain what we are. So an unwilling mold has to be shaped. So who's going to do that? And it's nature. Nature is doing that. From where? Where is nature? Everywhere. The entire universe. Think about it this way. The entire universe, infinite nature is reaching out to you at every moment in every possible way, including at a very subtle level the influences of all the planets and stars and thoughts of people and emotions passing through, but on a more material level and psychological level, the things which impact you most. And so you are under pressure at all times from all directions. Some are reasonably pleasant, some are painful. Why does it become pain? That's a very important point we come to. When there's a pressure and you yield to the pressure, there's no pain. When you refuse to yield, the pressure grows. And at some point, you see, your muscles have to tense. At some point, it becomes painful, and if you hang on long enough, it breaks. And then there's greater pain because you have the rebuilding that takes place. Pain always indicates a resistance to a pressure. Now, sometimes the resistance is needed because there's a pressure for you to collapse also. You don't want to collapse. But that's not so painful. That makes you stronger. You know, they say adversity strengthens you if it doesn't kill you. Something in that direction. So there's a pressure, which is a healthy pressure. You actually grow as a result. You don't feel too much pain at least, or it's a little. But where you refuse to change, the pressure keeps growing until it becomes painful. So, pain is the hand of nature. So nature herself being infinity, a hand, a projection, a special point of pressure. Pain is the hand of nature sculpturing men to greatness. She's not doing it because it gives her joy to make you suffer. She's doing it because you are still not your full potential, and her pressure is to assist you in that development. She sees the greatness that has to be, and she pushes you towards that. From the soul's point of view, therefore, this is the part of that process of the flowering, of the potential of your nature, your personality. So, pain is the hand of nature sculpturing men to greatness. But where's the intelligence that's guiding her hand? An inspired labor chisels with heavenly cruelty an unwilling mold. So while you're unwilling, the chiseling of her action is cruel, apparently. Chiseling away. Sometimes you have to cut, chip, hard, painful. But the labor is inspired. She knows exactly what's needed to give you the best kind of support to make you grow forward. But it is a heavenly cruelty. It is out of love that she pushes you. Even as a mother allows a child to fall repeatedly as he tries to walk, out of love. And when it's too much, she's of course there. But otherwise you have to allow that. So we are in this very interesting shaping process. And from the point that we begin to participate, the pain fades away. As long as we resist, the pain grows. So observe in your life, wherever you have a pain point, it's a point where you have a resistance to change. Participate in the change, the pain goes away rapidly. Instead, it becomes a joyous growth. So from the soul's perspective, you're growing rapidly, or you've come here for that growth, and everything is there to help you, and you allow yourself to be carried. The first principle of true teaching is being fulfilled by these two gifts, all of which trace back to the soul's values, the soul's aspiration. The second principle of true teaching is that the mind must be consulted in its own growth. And that means you have to consult your soul's aspiration, your mind's aspiration, your heart's desires, your body's capacity, and take all these into account. I don't elaborate, but leave it at a very practical level. The third principle, you grow from the near to the far, that which is closest to you, the most joyous, the most easy, the most satisfying and fun, where you experience growth. Start with those. Grow towards that which is farther. But this shaping of infinity is now going to be our key. Sri Aurobindo uses this phrase, and I now come back to that idea of what happens at the end of this life. One of the problems, I said, was what do you do when you come back? But the other problem is, when you come back, what will you remember? And in this life, how many years did it take you to wake up to this reality and to your aspiration and to organize your life around it? It's kind of late. I don't want to be so late the next time. If only I could remember into the next life, isn't it? And here comes the key Sri Aurobindo gives us. He actually tells you how to do that, to ensure that you are able to continue the conscious aspiration. Maybe not the whole of the personality, but enough that into the next life you have a reasonably conscious awareness that you begin right as early as you can. And for this, he says, there are 3 requirements. The first of these is that you must become plastic to the touch of the infinite. Then the personality itself can be shaped and be plastic enough that you don't have to shed it and take on a new personality. And then you can carry at least the nucleus of that plasticity into the next life. The second is that around this nucleus of aspiration, your personality needs to be organized sufficiently. And it's only the organized part which will be carried, the rest well drops off because it's not integrated. And the key for this in our practice will be everything that you do that's important for you, align it to your soul's aspiration. Let it be a means for the soul's actualization or a means for the soul's nourishment. And that's all that we have been discussing from the beginning, all those activities, including art, music, poetry, and all other activities of creativity and discovery. Okay? Integrating them around the soul aspiration, the essence of all that learning would stay with you. And the third is you have to, so to say, dissolve the barrier between the surface person and the deeper ranges, what we call the subliminal, because it is in the subliminal region that the knowledge would be carried, and the surface part bound to the body is largely lost. So infusing and deepening the consciousness, organizing around the soul's aspiration, and consciously shaping your personality all the way to the most surface parts to become more and more flexible. The inner core is more flexible, the outer more rigid by default, but whatever you can, make it as flexible as possible. Now, if you look at these three guidelines, you find all that we discussed encapsulated. And we come back to those three words we started with. If you want this transformation, the three things required: consciousness, plasticity, surrender. And the surrender is the total self-giving of all that you're building, all that you're organizing, all that you are, all that you do, in total self-giving to the Divine Mother entirely and exclusively. You cannot do it all the time, but you can do it for 5 seconds or 10 seconds of intense concentration every morning or every evening. Find the time that suits you. Sit quietly, gather yourself, center yourself as far as possible around your aspiration. Enter in relation to the Divine Mother or to whatever aspect or form of the Divine to which your aspiration is most intensely awake. And then all that you're aware of, as much as you can, including everything as far as possible, including the parts of the body made conscious. Gather it all in your awareness and turn to the Divine and give yourself entirely and exclusively in a total immersion and self-loss. Remain immersed in this as long as you can, as long as it remains, and then gradually let your awareness return. Let your personality coalesce out of the immersion into oneness and be newborn from that self-loss in the Divine. Newborn literally as a new person just now formed out of her love, out of her substance, out of her consciousness. And this is now the base, the person who is going to begin my day. Very simple practice. Does not take more than 5 or 10 seconds of intense concentration. Do it to whatever extent you can comfortably. And you have a whole program for the years ahead of you, for your integral education to be realized across lives in our eternal journey of the soul's discovery of the universe, of Satchidananda, and of itself. Namaste. We'll take a moment to concentrate on this.